Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know we love to explore all sorts of history here, but this time we're diving deep into a period tailor-made for military history fans.
Yeah, the Roman Empire.
Right, at the peak of its military might. We'll be looking at Trajan and Hadrian.
Two really fascinating emperors.
And, their decisions, especially during these big conflicts they had with Parthia and Judea.
Those decisions had consequences.
Huge ones, right? Ripple effects across history, really shaping Europe as we know it today.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? It's not just about, memorizing battles and dates.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how these emperors' choices, their victories, their setbacks, how those reverberated through time, influencing the course of European history.
So let's start with Trajan. He's often depicted in the sources as, well, like a master strategist almost.
He was very methodical.
Right, and he conquers Dacia pretty early on.
Which really sets the stage for his ambitions in the East.
So why Parthia? What made that region so strategically important?
Well, Parthia was kind of a thorn in Rome's side, always. It was a powerful empire, controlled key trade routes, and it posed a constant threat to Roman influence in the East. So for Trajan conquering Parthia, it wasn't just expansion.
Right.
It was about securing Rome's dominance, ensuring stability on that eastern frontier.
So it wasn't just about, adding another jewel to the Roman crown.
Yeah.
It was about eliminating a rival.
Yeah, and controlling those vital trade routes.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. So how did he actually go about it? Did he just march in there?
Well, he needed a reason, right? A justification.
Of course.
So there was this Armenian rebellion, and he used that as a pretext to launch his campaign, frame the whole thing as a defensive war.
Oh, so classic. Defend ourselves by attacking first.
Exactly. And it worked. Got public support for this big military undertaking.
Yeah, I bet. The Roman people, they were already kind of wary of Parthia's influence.
Yeah, they saw it as a threat, so it was a smart move politically. Very clever.
Yeah. And how did the campaign itself actually go?
Oh, it was a huge success. Trajan swept through Mesopotamia, captured Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital.
Wow.
And even reached the Persian Gulf.
The Persian Gulf. No Roman army had ever gone that far.
No, this was unprecedented. A moment of total triumph.
Trajan must have felt invincible at that point.
Well, he did. But then, right in the middle of the celebrations, news arrives from back home. A major Jewish revolt had broken out in Judea.
Oh, wow. So victory abroad and trouble back home. What a turn of events. So what was it? Was this just because Trajan was away, or was there more to it?
It's complicated, a lot of factors. But there was definitely resentment brewing for a long time. Remember, this was only a few decades after Titus had crushed the first Jewish revolt.
Right.
And destroyed the Second Temple.
A huge turning point in their history.
Exactly. And that left a scar. Deep resentment of Roman rule. And when Trajan left to fight in Parthia, he took most of the Roman garrisons with him from Judea and Egypt.
So it left this power vacuum?
Right. Perfect conditions for rebellion.
Now the Jewish revolt in Alexandria. That's in Egypt, right?
Right. A major city in Roman Egypt. And they weren't even targeting the Romans there.
They weren't?
No, they went after the Greeks.
Interesting. So what's going on there?
Well, there was this big rivalry, had been for a long time, between the Jewish and Greek communities in Alexandria. Different religions, different cultures. The Jews saw the Greeks as kind of collaborators with Rome in their oppression.
So with the Romans busy fighting in Parthia.
They saw a chance to strike at a weaker point, the Greeks.
This is fascinating how all these political and personal things get all tangled up.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these weren't just wars between empires. It was about cultures and ideologies clashing too. And in Alexandria, that clash got really, really ugly.
This Kitos War.
Brutal.
Our sources, especially Cassius Dio, paint a horrific picture of the violence.
Yeah. The Jewish forces, they gained ground at first, but they just couldn't match the Roman legions in the end. The Romans crushed the revolt. A lot of bloodshed on both sides. And it just made the tensions even worse.
A tragic cycle. It sounds like Trajan, despite his military brilliance, left behind a very unstable situation in the East.
And then he died on his way back to Rome, exhausted from years of campaigning. And that brings us to Hadrian.
His successor. So Hadrian inherits this huge empire full of internal strife, external threats.
It's a real challenge.
This is where things get really interesting, don't you think? Because Hadrian, he was a different kind of emperor.
Oh, yeah, much more cautious, pragmatic.
And he made some big decisions that had a huge impact on the empire, and especially on the Jewish people.
He really did. Hadrian's approach to ruling was very different from Trajan's. Trajan was all about expansion.
Right.
But Hadrian, he realized that it was more important to secure what Rome already had than to conquer new territory.
So what did he do? Did he just abandon all of Trajan's conquest of Parthia?
Well, he had to make a tough decision, and he chose to withdraw Roman forces from Mesopotamia.
I see.
It was just too vast, too unstable to hold on to. He decided to focus on defending the borders that Rome already had.
So a strategic retreat, was that it? Was he just happy to maintain things as they were?
No, not exactly. He believed in strengthening what Rome already possessed, like Hadrian's Wall in Britain. You know about that.
Yeah, of course.
It wasn't built for conquest.
Yeah,
It was about securing existing territory, defending it, a physical symbol of his philosophy. Consolidate and fortify what you have.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It wasn't about aggression. It was about defining a clear boundary. So it was a major shift in Roman policy, wasn't it?
Huge shift. Trajan was all about looking outward, expanding. But Hadrian, he was focused inward. He wanted to make sure Rome was strong from within, control what they already had.
Makes you wonder if he saw Trajan's campaigns as kind of unsustainable, even harmful to the empire in the long run.
Yeah, perhaps he did. He was definitely more focused on managing internal challenges and making sure Roman control over existing territories was solid, rather than going after risky new conquests.
And all of this shift in policy, it had a big impact on how Rome interacted with its subjects.
Especially the Jewish people in Judea.
And that's where things get even more interesting, right? Because now Hadrian's personal life comes into play, his relationship with Antinous.
And that has a surprising impact on his policies. And it ultimately contributes to one of the biggest Jewish revolts in Roman history.
Sounds like a story for next time on the Deep Dive. Be sure to come back as we explore Hadrian's reign, his decisions, and the events that led to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which changed the Jewish diaspora and left its mark on Europe and the Middle East.
Welcome back.
So last time we were discussing Hadrian.
Right.
And how different he was from Trajan in terms of ruling the Roman Empire.
Completely different approach.
And you mentioned how Hadrian's personal life, specifically his relationship with Antinous, would actually play a role in his policies in Judea. That's what I'm really curious about. How did something so personal end up intersecting with such a significant historical event?
Well, to understand that, we have to start with a tragedy. Antinous, the guy Hadrian was so devoted to, he drowned in the Nile River. Mysterious circumstances, nobody really knows what happened, but Hadrian was just devastated. I mean, completely heartbroken. And we have to remember, in Roman society, same-sex relationships weren't really that unusual, and everyone knew how much Hadrian loved Antinous.
So this wasn't just some fling. This was a deep personal loss for Hadrian. But how does this personal grief end up impacting Judea?
Well, Hadrian's grief was so intense, so profound, that he decided to deify Antinous. Made him into a god, commissioned all these statues and temples to be built in his honor, all across the empire. And that's where Judea comes in.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. He decides to build a temple to Antinous in Judea, of all places. I can't imagine that went over well. I mean, given the already tense relationship between Rome and the Jewish people there.
It was a huge mistake, really monumental miscalculation on Hadrian's part. Remember, the Jewish people were still reeling from the destruction of the Second Temple, decades earlier, and to them, this new temple, a pagan temple in Jerusalem, dedicated to someone they saw as a Roman idol. It was a slap in the face, a symbol of their oppression.
Yeah, talk about adding insult to injury.
Yeah.
So Hadrian's personal grief, was understandable as it was,
Yeah.
led him to make this decision that had huge political and religious ramifications.
It did. And on top of that, he outlawed circumcision.
Really? That's a major step. I mean, circumcision wasn't just some religious practice for the Jews. It was a fundamental part of their faith, a symbol of their covenant with God. Banning it was like attacking their very identity.
Exactly. And that was the last straw. That's what sparked the Bar Kokhba revolt, named after Simon Bar Kokhba, the leader. And this wasn't just another uprising. This was a full-blown war for independence, a fight for their religious freedom, their cultural survival, a desperate fight.
So they weren't just fighting for political autonomy. It was much deeper than that.
Yeah.
What was the actual fighting like?
Oh, it was brutal. It raged for 3 years. Bar Kokhba was a brilliant military leader. The Jewish rebels were really determined, driven by their faith and their desire for freedom, and they were actually really successful at first against the Roman legions. They even managed to establish an independent state for a short time, minted their own coins, set up their own administration.
Wow. An independent Jewish state. right there in the Roman Empire. That's incredible. It really shows how much they hated Roman rule.
Yeah, they were determined. It was a remarkable feat. But in the end, they just couldn't overcome the full might of the Roman military. After 3 years of fighting, the revolt was crushed, and the consequences for the Jewish people were devastating.
I can only imagine. So what happened after the Romans regained control?
Well, the Romans, they wanted revenge. They weren't messing around. Massacres, whole villages and towns destroyed, thousands of Jews enslaved. It was brutal. The Bar Kokhba revolt really was a turning point in the relationship between Rome and Judea. It had these huge repercussions that would be felt for centuries.
It's heartbreaking. So much violence. How did Hadrian react to all of this?
He was probably bitter after this long and costly war, and he went further than any Roman emperor before him. He ordered all Jews expelled from Judea.
Wow. Expelled from their own land. That's incredible. That's the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, right?
Exactly. Almost 2,000 years of Jews scattered all over the world, longing to return to their homeland. And Hadrian, he didn't stop there. He even renamed Judea, called it Syria Palestina.
Syria, Palestina.
It's a name that comes from the ancient Philistines, the old enemies of the Israelites.
So he didn't just want to defeat them. He wanted to erase their presence in Judea, their history, almost like he was trying to rewrite history.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that the name Palestine, it has its roots in ancient history, but Hadrian using it here, it was a deliberate choice, meant to cut the Jewish people off from their connection to the land.
It's really a reminder of how history can be manipulated to serve political goals. Renaming Judea was a way for Hadrian to show that Rome was in control, that they control the narrative.
Absolutely. The whole story of the Bar Kokhba revolt and what happened after, it shows how even something personal, like Hadrian's grief over Antinous, that decision to build a temple in Jerusalem, it can have these unintended consequences, huge consequences that ripple through history in unpredictable ways.
It's amazing, really, how something so personal and something so political can get all mixed up together and lead to these events that shape the course of history for centuries. It makes you wonder, did Hadrian ever regret what he did? Or did he see this revolt as some kind of inevitable clash between civilizations?
It's hard to say for sure what Hadrian felt, but his actions, they had a lasting impact on the Jewish people, scattering them, contributing to the complex situation in the Middle East today.
It's a lot to think about. So this is the end of Hadrian's reign then. Did he ever find peace? After all the turmoil and the bloodshed, what did he leave behind?
Well, as Hadrian got older, he started thinking about who would rule after him, the future of the empire, and he decided to adopt Antoninus Pius as his heir. Antoninus was known for being level-headed, good administrator, very different from Hadrian.
So he went for stability after all that chaos. That makes sense. But didn't he like Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor?
He did. He saw potential in Marcus Aurelius. But Aurelius was too young to be emperor, so Hadrian came up with this plan. Antoninus would rule first, and then he would adopt Aurelius as his heir.
A very elaborate plan to ensure the future of the empire.
It was. And the thing is, Antoninus, he lived a long time, ruled for 23 years, almost like Hadrian's plan backfired a little bit.
So Marcus Aurelius had to wait. And during that time, Antoninus ruled over a pretty peaceful and prosperous period.
Right.
Quite a contrast to the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian.
It was, and it says a lot about Antoninus's leadership, that his reign is kind of forgotten compared to the more dramatic times. But it was a time of peace and stability. The focus shifted from conquering to taking care of the Roman people.
And finally, Marcus Aurelius became emperor, the philosopher emperor. And he inherited a stable empire, thanks in part to the decisions made by his predecessors, Trajan with his ambition, Hadrian with his pragmatism.
It's all connected. And that's where we'll leave things for now. But before we finish this deep dive into Roman military history, let's take a moment to think about these emperors and the conflicts they fought. Their decisions, their victories, their defeats. It all shaped the course of European history.
It really is incredible how the personal lives of these emperors, their ambitions, their grief, the choices they made, how all of that got tangled up with the fate of the empire, and how it all shaped Europe, even today.
It's what makes studying military history so fascinating. It's not just about battles and who won or lost.
Right.
It's about the human side of things, the motivations, the decisions, the things that led to these pivotal moments, these turning points.
Totally. And in this deep dive, we've really seen how those human stories played out on this massive scale. I mean, Trajan's ambition, his drive for glory, Hadrian trying to hold everything together, the Jewish people fighting for their faith and freedom.
These stories, they resonate,
Yeah.
even after thousands of years.
Absolutely. And they teach us things
Hmm.
about power, ambition, the struggle for identity. These things are timeless.
They really are.
Trajan. His Parthian campaigns were impressive
Mm,
militarily. I mean, he
Yeah.
expanded the empire like never before.
he did, pushed the boundaries. But in the end, it was too much.
Unsustainable.
It led to instability, revolts. Classic case of overreach, I think.
Right. His ambition, it worked at first,
Yeah.
but it also stretched Rome too thin, created weaknesses.
And those weaknesses eventually contributed to the empire's decline.
Now, Hadrian, he was more cautious, wasn't he? He knew that defending what Rome already had was important.
He did.
He pulls back from Mesopotamia, focuses on strengthening the borders. Really smart move.
Very strategic. It helped to stabilize things during a really chaotic time.
Shows that true strength isn't always about attacking, isn't it?
No.
Sometimes it's about knowing when to consolidate, when to defend, when to choose peace over war.
Absolutely.
But of course, we can't talk about Hadrian without talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's a major turning point in Jewish history.
It is.
And that whole thing started with a temple.
A temple to Antinous in Jerusalem, and then the ban on circumcision?
Yeah.
I mean, what a recipe for disaster.
It was a clash of cultures, religions, misunderstanding, prejudice, political blunders.
And in the end, tragedy.
The Romans won,
Yeah.
but the consequences were huge. The Jews were expelled from Judea, scattered all over the world, and that shaped the Jewish diaspora as we know it today.
It did. It's a sobering reminder of how political decisions can have unintended consequences, especially when religion and cultural intolerance get involved.
And yet the Jewish people survived,
Mm.
thrived even. Amazing resilience.
It's an incredible story of perseverance in the face of real adversity.
So for everyone listening who's interested in military history, I think we've learned some important things here about how emperors and empires and the struggles of everyday people, how they all connect, how they shape the course of history.
We've seen the impact of military strategy. What happens when ambition goes too far? We've seen the power of human resilience. These lessons, they're relevant even today, thousands of years later.
We've journeyed back to ancient Rome, a time of power, ambition, conflict, and ultimately change. We've seen emperors rise and fall, we've seen civilizations clash, and we've seen people fight for what they believed in, their way of life.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And even though our deep dive is ending here, I encourage everyone to keep exploring. Read more about this period, these emperors, these conflicts. Think about their impact on history and how it all connects to us. Because history isn't just a bunch of dates and names.
Right.
It's a story full of lessons that we can still learn from today, about choices, about power, and about the importance of understanding the past. To help us understand our present,